Hi, I'm Jonathan Bowman-Perks and welcome to my favourite time of the week. I'm very lucky to be with Paul Cleal, who I've known for some years. And Paul is a very successful leader by anybody's standard. 21 years in PwC, a board member at the age of 40, in charge of all of the people issues in PwC. And then also he went out to West Africa, to Nigeria, looking after all those areas, and a number of other things that he's now going to talk about. But Paul, be very interested in your views on leadership. But firstly, just give me a bit of flavour of the different things you're now doing as a sort of portfolio career, having finished your time at PwC.
Yeah, hi Jonathan. It's been 2 years pretty much since I moved on from the firm after 21 years, 16 as a partner, mostly in London, but that bit at the end in Lagos, which was interesting, as we were just saying. So these days I decided I wanted to continue what I was doing in the margins of my job when I was at the firm, and a lot of that was about social mobility and education, because those are issues that I see as really important for, I guess in many ways, people like me, who particularly those I mentor now, who are growing up in South London like I did, but perhaps not expecting to have the sort of career that I ended up having in PwC. So I spend quite a lot of time in schools, but one of my main non-exec roles is Deputy Chair of University of Kingston in southwest London, and that's been a big learning process over the last couple of years, learning about higher education as a market and how the changes in funding have altered the horizon and made life pretty difficult actually for institutions like ours. So that's been really good. Happily, Kingston's in a much better place than it was 2 years ago, and really heading in the right direction. We've made a lot of real progress, and it's been great to be a part of that. Another one is public appointment at National Citizen Service Trusts. It's a body that, depending on whether you've got children who are GCSE age, you may or may not be familiar with it, but over 100,000 people, 16 to 17 year olds, went on it last year. It's a 4-week programme sponsored by the government through Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and I'm part of the new organisation formed last December, given a Royal Charter under an Act of Parliament, appointed by the Queen to be a board member on that. Wow. So I'm chairing the Audit and Risk Committee there, and we're working through some major recommissioning of new contracts and making sure that the programme's delivered safely and all the safeguardings are done properly.
Brilliant. So you will have had a real wide spread of experience, seen good leadership, seen some bad leadership. We were talking earlier, and I really liked your 3 themes you found of what makes good leaders. Do you want to just perhaps share it with our audience so they could hear it?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is most important, really for any leader is integrity. I've always tried to be honest with people. Sometimes you feel like maybe you need to keep information to yourself, but generally speaking, I don't subscribe to the idea that people only should get information on a need-to-know basis. I mean, I think you have a good reason not for telling people information. And I think I've always appreciated the honesty, integrity in leaders, and I've found that people have appreciated it in me, and it's often the quality that people have talked about in particular when they if I kind of get feedback from them and see what they appreciate about my style. I think clarity is important in a leader too. I mean, being able to create a vision and communicate that vision in a way that people understand, I think is absolutely essential. There are lots of situations now that I see where there's a complete lack of clarity. I mean, you can see examples in politics. I don't talk about politics too much, but we've had some real lack of leadership recently, and a lot of that I think has been down to a lack of clear vision about what people are trying to achieve. So that's another big area.
And your third?
The third, come on. Can we have a pause?
No, it's all just be very natural. But what we did talk about, it'll come to you in a moment, was we did talk about inclusive leadership. Because you've experienced where people have been very excluding, and part of your battle is to get a more understanding of greater diversity and more inclusive leadership, and that was a theme, wasn't it? Yeah,
that's right, and I think that's really thanks for prompting me on that. I think inclusivity has become a more important area. So I do some work on inclusivity, diversity and equality for the Premier League football, for example. That's an interesting area where the clubs are becoming very much an international brand, having been local entities historically. And some growing pains. I think as markets and countries and cities become more diverse, that's great, but it creates issues because of lack of understanding.
Yeah.
And of course, we find that we're living in a city like London. It's an incredibly diverse place, and you can no longer just appeal to a small group of people who are like you anymore. That's not enough. You might be dealing with 5-10% of your workforce. So people who historically adopted a traditional autocratic way of dealing with people who are pretty much like them from similar schools and universities now have to deal with people from all over the world, men, women, people with disabilities, people with various different challenges. Mental health was something we touched on earlier. You have to make everybody feel like they're part of it. So when you're going back to the point about clarity, when you're communicating your strategy, you have to find ways of getting it across in a way that will be understood, not just by people who think the way you do, but by everybody in the organisation.
And that actually probably brings us on this short clip, probably our final one. Many leaders, and you are a very inspiring leader, I've known you for some time, you use a coaching style, as does your wife Suzanne, she's a trained coach. But it's also great to find leaders that firstly have courage like you have, but also have humility to admit when they got it wrong. And what do you, looking back on your time as a young but successful board member of PwC, what would you reckon would be one of the lessons you had from when you got things wrong and you could have done better?
Well, I think a lot of what goes wrong often comes down to communication. And I remember when we were going through, when I was the head of the HR function and running people strategy for the firm, I thought we had a good, rational approach that people would understand, partners would understand, and I think probably I took too much of that for granted. And of course, as a board member, your diary is completely full, and there's one meeting after another, throughout the working week. So if you can avoid having to go out and talk to people, then sometimes you have to deal with some fires back in the office. And in the end, inevitably, you end up defaulting sometimes to not spending enough time going out and taking people with you. Yeah. I think I could have done more of that. And certainly in my later leadership roles in the firm, both in PwC Africa on the board there, and in particular when I was running the government and public sector practice in London for about 4 years, about 2011 to 14, 15, then I think I really made much more effort to make sure that people understood, because you can talk to people and think you're being clear, going back to the clarity point, but you've got to understand whether or not the point's landed.
Yeah.
And you have to tell the story in different ways, different media, and of course now we've got more media, you've got not just emails and voicemails, you've got in-person meetings, you've got all sorts of different other techniques that you can use to get the point across. You've got to work out how most people are going to hear your message, and it's got to be short, it's got to be snappy, and you've got to take people with you. And I think I didn't invest enough time in that time at some point.
Thank you. And finally, just in the last few moments of our time together, your father was very successful as a leader himself, in charge of the World Health Organization in Africa.
Yeah, that's right.
What would you say would be one of the tips that he would give to the audience here about good leadership?
Funny enough, when I interviewed him shortly before he died a couple of years ago, and talked to him about that period of time, we obviously have something in common genetically, because he made some of the same mistakes that I repeated later. And he often talks about not taking people with him, thinking quickly. He was a very creative man, very inspirational, but often he kind of got there too fast.
Yeah.
And you've got to kind of listen to people as well. You can't just get the message across, you've got to take them with you.
Thank you. Paul, it's a pleasure seeing you.
Jonathan.
Congratulations for all the work you've done, a very successful career thus far, and thanks for sharing your leadership thoughts.